Welcome. Delighted to see such a great group here this morning to talk about this very important issue. This is another great event organized by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And on behalf of Brian Lee Crowley, who unfortunately has taken ill and is not able to be here today, I will introduce this and set it off and send you his best wishes and welcome you. Thank you for coming out and joining this event. My name is Wayne Critchley. I have worked for many years in the area of pharmaceutical and health policy, both in the public and private sector. I'm currently a senior associate in the health and life sciences practice at Global Public Affairs here in Ottawa. Until recently, I guess until last month, I also served on a volunteer basis as chair of a patient advocacy group, the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, CORD. And also over the summer, I'm delighted to let you know that I joined the board of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So I'm really delighted to join Brian and David and the group here because I've always admired the work that this think tank does, and I'm delighted to be able to be part of it. So we're going to talk about U.S. plans to permit the importation of prescription drugs from Canada. This is not a brand new issue. It came up in a big way about 15 years ago. It has resurfaced in the last little while. And, I was thinking it's a really great idea when David mentioned that the Institute wanted to put something on this. That was good timing because I don't think too many people are really aware of it and are aware of the significant policy implications of this issue. So this is great. And sure enough, this morning, just before coming in, actually, I'm checking my Twitter feed, and I see that Abacus Polling has put out a new poll this morning. So you'll be able to check this later on. But after you go through the election polling numbers, you move on to the very first issue. It's the subject of reimportation into the U.S. And I was very interested to learn that more Canadians are aware of this than I thought. About half of the people polled were aware of the issue. So that's something, that's significant, and I think that's important. Also, over 60% had an immediate concern, of varying degrees, of course, but had an immediate concern about the possibility that this policy proposal from the U.S. would have an impact on Canadian supplies of drugs and could lead to drug shortages. So that's also a significant awareness. And a very large number, but probably not quite half, but a large number thought that the federal government should take some policy actions to address the issue. So that context, I think, makes me feel a little better that people are aware of it. But we still have to figure out what to do, what are the issues, and what to do about it. And so I think the timing of this session this morning is really appropriate, and will allow us to get into that. We have a tremendous panel, people who are experts in this area, who work in this area, and are very knowledgeable about it and are seized with it. So we're going to get a very good discussion from a number of different perspectives. Our format today is that we will start with a presentation by Dr. Brian Ferguson, and then I will ask the panel members to join me up here, and we'll join Brian and we'll have a panel discussion. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until the end of the panel discussion, and about 10:30 or so, I will open things up for questions from the floor. So to begin, let's get Brian Ferguson up here. I'd like to introduce Brian to you. Dr. Ferguson is a professor of economics at the University of Guelph and research fellow with the Canadian Centre for Health Economics. He is the author of several studies for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and has written and spoken about this particular issue on a number of occasions. And in fact, I recently read an article, Brian, from you that was written about 15 years ago when this issue first was front and center. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Ferguson.
Thanks, Wayne. Don't you hate the way things no longer disappear? You can't say, oh, 15 years ago, I have no idea what I said. But fortunately, as an academic, I can keep the question the same but change the answer over time. And I am, given the wide range of our panel today, I am going to speak from a slightly academic point of view. My apologies to those of you who would prefer that I didn't. As Wayne said, what we're essentially seeing is a remake of a movie from 15 or 20 years ago. And with a remake, there are always a couple of obvious questions. One is, why are they remaking it now? And the other is it any different from the first version? Is it any, are there any fundamental changes, or is it just the same thing all over again? Let me take the second question first. Is it different from the first time round? Certainly, I think in terms of the optics, it is. The whole question of, are the Americans essentially going to take our medications in bulk? That is still the key question. And it was established back then that if they really went ahead and did what they said they were going to do, this would create serious disruptions in our markets. But if you look back at the sort of discussions then, they focused much more on the issue of individuals in the U.S. being able to buy Canadian or presumed Canadian drugs from internet pharmacies. And because there is no guarantee that anything on the internet which claims to be in Canada is actually anywhere near Canada, and because there is no guarantee that any drugs which got to the U.S. with a Canadian stamp on them had actually in any sense originated in Canada rather than simply being transshipped through Canada, the FDA in those days was firmly opposed to the whole idea. They could not guarantee that these were in fact legitimate Canadian drugs. Whether there is such a thing as Canadian drugs or not, I'll touch on again in a moment. So that was one part of the story then. Also in terms of the story 15 or 20 years ago, there was a lot of misunderstanding, misinformation about the nature of the price differences between Canada and the U.S. It's certainly true that drug prices in the U.S. are higher generally than they are anywhere else, at least brand name drug prices. Generic drug prices in the U.S. have always tended to be lower. But in terms of the headline stories you saw back then, there were problems with the sample that was being looked at, and one thing that virtually never got mentioned was the loonie was at about 60 cents US then. And that was enough to wipe out an awful lot of any kind of difference in the drug price from the point of view of the U.S. Casual empiricism suggests that as the loonie kind of started to move back towards par, interest in reimportation faded away. Now we're at about 75 cents at the moment, but that's not, I think, enough to revive the interest in the same way that it was there before. In terms of why they're remaking the movie right now, well, we're aware of it now because assorted American politicians are now, leading politicians from both parties, are now talking about bringing in legislation to permit bulk export or bulk reimportation of drugs from Canada to the U.S. It's not so much a focus on individual purchases anymore, so much as it is on large-scale plans making purchases. But if you look at the things which have prompted political interest in this, politicians, let's face it, are interested in what catches the headlines, especially if it's annoying the voters. And I think we can pick up on a couple of broad themes here. A couple of them relate, in fact, to the state of the generics market in the US. And this is something that we may not be paying as much attention to as they are, but there has been an increasing tendency towards monopolization of various segments of the generics market in the US. If there are any economists in the room or speaking to economists in the room, our understanding of the industrial organizational dynamics of the generics market, I think, went wrong. We focused too much, and some researchers are now saying this, on what happened in the generic sector immediately after patent expiry on the brand name drugs, and not enough on the longer run dynamics of the generic sector itself. The poster child for this was Martin Shkreli, curing pharmaceuticals. And if you remember the Martin Shkreli story, what he did was find himself a company which was the sole supplier of a generic drug in the US. It was a very small market generic drug. That was why there was only one supplier in the US. He bought this company, and he jacked the price way up. All of a sudden, it was 1,000 times as high as it had been the day before. And it is reported, and I'm just taking this out of the newspaper so I don't swear to it, it is reported that he told one of his colleagues that he figured he could get away with this for 4 years. And it was 4 years because that's roughly the time it takes, he figured, for the FDA to approve a competing supplier of this particular drug. So what he saw was a regulatory situation which would give him a monopoly for about 4 years, and he was going to milk that monopoly for everything he possibly could during that 4-year period. And while we're not seeing quite as many blatant cases as the Shkreli one, we are seeing more and more of a tendency in actually both the American and the Canadian, to a lesser extent, Canadian generics markets to reductions in competition. In the US, they're showing up both in terms of shortages and in terms of price increases. In Canada, we have become more aware of shortages of certain generic drugs that we had been taking for granted. And that is something that we need to keep an eye on. It is, incidentally, I think, a policy area that can be dealt with by international agreement, by trade agreements, so long as they're actual sort of international agreements and not simply attempts by one country to impose its will on pretty much everybody else. Sticking with the generics market for a moment in a slightly related form, there is also, and what I'm talking about here are cases which have annoyed individual Americans. This is the sort of thing that they will talk about if you ask them about it, and therefore it's the sort of thing that gets through to politicians. The FDA has a program for, well, certain generic drugs were grandfathered in, meaning that they never went through any kind of formal clinical testing, but they'd been around for so long that the FDA simply allowed them to continue to be sold in generic form. It's got a program which grants a period of exclusivity. With the FDA, exclusivity is usually about 7 years, when it does it deliberately, to a company which will do some clinical trial testing on some of these grandfathered generic drugs. And again, you wouldn't want to say that there had been an enormous number of cases, but there have definitely been cases of companies which did this, got their 7-year basically monopoly period, and jack the price up to what the economists in the room will recognize as the static monopoly price. Again, speaking to economists, our understanding of the dynamics, the intertemporal optimal path for prices in this sector, that's something that we have to reconsider. We had tended to think of it as a very long horizon problem. I think increasingly in this sector, suppliers are thinking of it as a relatively short horizon problem, and therefore they're moving to a monopoly pricing, a static monopoly pricing situation much faster than they otherwise would have. Getting away from the generic sector, again, something which has annoyed or caught the attention, annoyed individual Americans and caught the attention of analysts, are orphan drugs. Now, orphan drugs are defined in the US basically as drugs dealing with conditions for which the market is so small that they would probably not be economically appealing, viable, profitable under normal regulatory rules. So again, in order to encourage research and development of orphan drugs, the Orphan Drug Act grants a certain period of exclusivity to any manufacturer which will go through the whole process, in this case the clinical trial process, the whole works. And a lot of people will tell you that it has worked extremely well, and it has. There's been a tremendous increase in research into small market drugs. So much so that small market orphan drugs are now more profitable than large market drugs, and indeed a certain number of orphan drugs have become financial blockbusters. And there seems to be a certain logical contradiction there. This has been particularly the case in cancer drugs. There's been quite a bit of work there, and there is a growing suspicion, even among analysts who, and I should be honest about this, I am one of those who is reasonably favorably disposed towards the pharmaceutical sector. It gets me in trouble with other health economists, but there you go. This is me being contrarian. But there is a distinct sense that a lot of these companies are now starting to slice the definition of diseases. They're using the whole personalized medicine thing in order to define diseases so narrowly that it's not actually all that hard to meet the requirement for being classified as an orphan disease or an orphan drug for an orphan disease. And one indication of this is that a number of these orphan drugs have become financial blockbusters. Another is that a number of these drugs have managed to acquire orphan status sequentially for a number of different conditions. And there is, as I say, even among people, I've talked to economists who on the whole think that the pharmaceutical sector is a socially valuable sector. There's a distinct suspicion that there is a certain amount of gaming going on there, and that gaming may actually be proving more profitable than some other areas of drug development. But again, what it translates into is periods of market exclusivity. And if firms are taking the market exclusivity period as pretty much the entire planning horizon, then they're going to engage in static monopoly pricing for basically that period. Those are areas where I think individual Americans are very much aware of what's going on. There's another one that they're slowly becoming aware of and that we're going to have to become aware of, and that is biologics. Biologics and the whole issue of the entry or restrictions on entry of biosimilars, they have in fact made the news recently because insulin is a biologic. So when Bernie Sanders made his trip up to Canada, the newspapers didn't mention biologic. But in terms of the way insulin is produced and in terms of the way the economics of the market for insulin work, you're looking at a very, very early biologic. And that's one where pricing is going to be more of an issue in the future. Now, I think, though, that the most serious concern that we as Canadians need to have is that there are serious politicians, leading politicians from both parties, who actually believe that there is such a thing as Canadian drugs. I mean, yes, we export drugs, but on a worldwide basis, we run a fairly large trade deficit. That means we import a lot of drugs. About a third of the drugs that we import come from the US. This is why they talk about reimportation, although I'm not sure they're actually aware of the connection. So what, I won't name the politicians, you can fill in the blanks, but what they're doing is saying, we're going to export these drugs to Canada. We are then going to turn around and re-import them back into the US. When they come back into the US, because the Canadian Patent Medicine Price Review Board will have sprinkled its magic Canadian pixie dust over them, their prices will still be low in the US. If you look at the experience of the European Union, which has been dealing with the whole reimportation business much more continuously than we have, because of the whole question of how do you reconcile having different prices for drugs in different parts of what is supposed to be a single market. So the European Union has been trying to tackle these issues in that whole period in which it was basically something that we forgot about. But one thing which has come out of the experience of the European Union is that most of the financial benefit of reimportation goes to the reimporters. There is a very slight benefit to the national drug plans, and virtually none to consumers, but since they're pretty much all covered, they don't actually care all that much. In terms of, Wayne mentioned that a significant part of the survey think we should do something. I think we need to do two things. I think we need to look at putting up some kind of mechanism to prevent our market being seriously disrupted. I'm sure you've all seen estimates along the lines of ones which say that, oh, if 20% of Americans buy their drugs from Canada, that would wipe out our market, our supply, our usual supply anyway, within a matter of a few months. But beyond that, if we simply put barriers, export barriers up, all we're going to do is take the heat off the drug companies and put the heat on the Canadian government. I think at some point we have to say to the Americans, look, instead of looking for quick, easy, pixie dust type solutions, you have to take a serious look at why exactly your drug prices are what they are and think about making changes to a number of those policies. And at this point, Wayne, I'm just going to throw the whole thing over to the rest of the panel.
And could I ask the panel to come up, please? Thank you, Brian, for leaving us with a contentious question at the end. That's, I guess that's something a good speaker always does. Okay, so I'm going to, first of all, I'm just going to introduce the panelists very quickly. Then I'm going to ask each of them in turn to take a few minutes, tell us a little bit more about themselves and the organization they're with, and their interest in this topic, and then we'll get into a panel discussion. So, Shabir, I'm going to start with you. You're the Executive Director of the Alliance for Safe Medicines.
Partnership for Safe Medicines.
Partnership for Safe Medicines, sorry.
Different group.
I couldn't check my notes fast enough. Shabir, delighted to have you here. Shabir is based in the U.S., of course, so very helpful because he'll bring a perspective from south of the border. Joel Walker is the VP policy, whatever, at Canadian Pharmacists Association. I think everybody in Ottawa knows Joelle. And CPHA has taken an important role in this exercise. So welcome, Joelle. Really delighted to have you here. The Honourable Ujjal Dosanjh is recognizable to most people, former Premier of British Columbia and the Canadian Minister of Health 15 years ago, who actually introduced legislation to address this issue at that time. So no better expert can we find, I think, than Ujjal. And we're so delighted you're able to come out from BC to attend this morning. And then next to Ujjal is Seema Nagpal. Seema is VP also of something or other, she'll tell us, at Diabetes Canada, formerly the Canadian Diabetes Association, a very significant patient organization in this country, which of course potentially impacted by this policy. And Brian Ferguson, you know, so we've already done that. Shabir, could I ask you to start, please?
Sure. I can do it from here. I don't need to stand. So thank you, everybody, for coming. My name is Shabir Safdar. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Safe Medicines. The Partnership is an organization that doesn't exist in Canada, so I have to explain to you what it is. We are a coalition of healthcare supply chain entities. So everybody that touches a medicine, from the factory floor to the patient that takes it, is a member of our coalition. So all the manufacturers, or at least the trade associations that represent them, because we don't have any corporate members, just trade associations and nonprofits. The wholesalers, who aggregate, bulk, and then distribute. The pharmacies and pharmacists are members. There's 30 some odd state pharmacy associations that are members of the partnership. And then patient advocates. And if you were to ask all of those groups, what is the problem in the healthcare system, they would all point at each other, right? Like the manufacturers would point at the distributors and so on and so forth. They only agree on one thing, and my mission is very, very narrow, which is supply chain safety and counterfeits. That's all I get to work on, which is not bad. When you work in policy and politics, to have one issue to work on. It allows you to get out of a lot of difficult conversations. But that's all we focus on. And we have actually had 4 major waves of counterfeits in America since we've been tracking them in 2000. The latest of which, and I have materials I would love for you to take since my staff has worked hard on them, is a wave that you've also seen of counterfeit pills made with fentanyl, Xanax, opioids, etc. They've been found in 49 American states, everywhere except Hawaii, and they've killed people in over 38, including Prince, if you didn't know that. We are here, I am here today, because I am concerned that there's no way that we're actually getting Canadian medicine if my country does importation. And the history of why that's happening now is an interesting, longer conversation we can have. But the way that safety experts in America see it is this. We're either going to get Canadian supply, which will last 165 days. Right? My board president just did that paper that was referred to in the opening. If 20% of Americans ordered their prescriptions from the actual Canadian drug supply, you would be out in 165 days. And if you count up Florida, Colorado, Maine, and Vermont, and add in a few of the other 13 states that will have legislation in 2020, you hit 20%. And so it's a foregone conclusion that we will run you dry. That's not good for you. Since I'm here every year for a family reunion, that makes me very sad. But after we run you dry, someone will still sell us Canadian labeled medication. What we have learned from the opioid crisis and other counterfeit issues that we've had is that if there is a good price to be had on medication and you are willing to just take a second and close your eyes because you're getting a great price, someone will sell you medicine that looks right and they'll promise you is right. They'll even present to you a pedigree that says it was bought and sold from all the right people, but it will not be the right medicine. It will either be complete counterfeits with no active ingredient or partial, substandard, insufficient active ingredient. We have, unfortunately, the fatalities to show that this is what happens. And that is my concern, is that whether or not we decimate your drug supply, which we should not do, by the time we figure out what's happening, we'll have hurt a whole lot of Americans as well. And it's a foregone conclusion that that is what we'll get as counterfeits. So that is why I'm here today.
Great. Thank you very much, Shabir. That's interesting. Raise a number of things that are going to lead to questions later on. We'll come back. Joelle, Can you tell us a little bit more about you and the role of CPHA on this file?
Sure. So I'm the VP of Public Affairs, which on any given day when I speak to my mother, who has no idea what that means, I have to tell her that it's basically what my boss tells me and throws just about anything my way and says, please deal with this. But really what's kind of fun about this job is I get to represent Canada's 42,000 pharmacists who are working very hard every day to make sure that Canadians have access to the medications that they need. Unfortunately, over the last 4 years that I've been at CPHA, I've heard this sort of like grumbling, constant grumbling from my members saying drug shortages are a problem, we have them all the time, and I had no real concept of what that means, with the exception that I had a drug shortage very early on in my life, and I was really angry at the pharmacists because I couldn't figure out why they couldn't figure this out, and but I moved past it. And so what we did last year was we actually surveyed Canadians and we surveyed pharmacists to get a better sense of what drug shortages look like in Canada. And I was hoping to make some kind of news story out of it because I know my members care very deeply about this. And so I was thinking maybe 1 in 10 Canadians has had a drug shortage, but most people probably wouldn't even know they've had a drug shortage because the pharmacist and their team are working behind the counter trying to figure something out. And I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked when I found out that 1 in 4 Canadians said that they themselves or a family member had experienced a drug shortage. And then when we sort of unpacked that with pharmacists saying, 30 to 50% of their weekly orders can't get filled, that's unbelievable. And the amount of time that they're spending dealing on shortages. So it really became, I think, in the last year or so, something that, pharmacists and physicians and other people are kind of constantly working in the background trying to deal with it. But this, I think, has really, the profile of drug shortages has really increased. And then we had a few last summer, like the EpiPen, which was huge because it's a life-saving medications for kids and people who have allergies. And we had a really big valsartan recall, again, affecting a huge number of people. So I think it just became more clear for Canadians that this is a real and present threat to public health care in Canada. And then on top of that, so here we have this really huge issue around drug shortages and the availability of medications in Canada. And then on top of that comes on to this, people saying, well, we're going to import medications from Canada when we don't even have enough to supply ourselves now. So I want to say one thing is that, when you talk to a pharmacist who is someone coming into their pharmacy, especially on sort of those border towns when Bernie Sanders came up and there have been patients coming up to Canada for years, for 20 years coming to get medications, the issue is not, the person standing in front of them. You feel incredible sympathy wanting to give them the medications that they need, And so pharmacists are there trying to manage that therapy. And I think Seema will tell a little bit of a story potentially, or I'll tell it on her behalf about a patient that she's heard of that had some issues. And it's not that we're not wanting to help our southern friends, it's that we just aren't equipped. We just don't have that supply. And I'll sort of conclude on this, which when I went to the States last week with Shabir, we met with HHS, the department that is crafting this legislation. They are moving ahead. They have said very clearly that this is a mandate that they've been given. They, I think, have some sympathy for us. I think the term they said was, we recognize that this would be annoying to Canadians, to which I sort of bit my tongue. But they are moving ahead with this, despite some of the challenges and concerns that we've expressed and that our government's expressed in the past, because they see this as an easy fix to a problem that they have. And so I think we really need to be very aware of this. Wayne, you, I think, referred to the Abacus data this morning that talked about awareness. When we polled in August, we asked almost the same question. 70% of Canadians were aware. I think that number went down to about 48%. So people, bless them in Canada, have a short attention span and have said, they've sort of forgotten in the last month that this is an issue that they deeply cared about a month ago. So I think the importance of keeping that pressure on is important. I hope that the next government will take this issue very seriously, and we're just going to help find some solutions because, I think all of us here, 1 in 4, looks like we might be affected by a drug shortage in our lifetime.
Great, thank you, Joelle. That was very helpful. Yuzhou, you have a different perspective.
Well, first of all, you said I was an expert. I'm no expert. I just had the misfortune of being the Minister of Health when last time this crisis erupted. And it was a different crisis at that time. It was about cross-border prescriptions. And in one of those years, 4 or 2005, we had exported $1 billion worth of prescriptions to the U.S. In about 2 million packages, cross-border prescriptions, inappropriately countersigned by doctors who never met the patients, and inappropriately filled out by the pharmacists. And there wasn't much sympathy for the issue within government or outside of government or within Health Canada. So I started the process of shaming all of us. I went across the country making statements, went to Harvard to speak at the medical school to raise the issue, went to the United States Senate, met with Senator Vitter, who's now retired, has become a lobbyist, probably for the pharmaceuticals, who knows. He was very explicit in his intentions, and his remarks to me were essentially, and I quote paraphrase, we want to dismantle your system of price controls or price regulation because you pose a threat to our free market, and you're a problem because looking at you, everybody in the United States accuses us politicians of doing nothing. So if we don't have your system next door, then we wouldn't be to blame for the higher prices. That was their logic. And I look at the issue today, I think it is still their logic. The politicians in the United States of America are generally cowards and aren't prepared to confront the pharmaceutical industry, aren't prepared to regulate their own prices or force the pharmaceutical industry to bring the prices to a level where they're affordable for Americans. And therefore, they think this is an easy fix because we have our price regulatory system and they can simply send us some medicines and then re-import them. And I remember, and I don't know whether it was a sentence uttered by someone else, but it was in my speech when I spoke at Harvard, that Canada can't be a drugstore for the United States of America. And, you know, but we had huge, vehement opposition to bringing about any legislative solutions from Manitoba, which was selling tons of prescriptions cross-border, including BC as well, and some others in the Atlantic. And within government, within cabinet, there was opposition. Health Canada wasn't very pleased. But I essentially forced everyone to pay attention because I was worried about, I'm an immigrant. I come from a background of scarcity. Any threat of scarcity actually is very threatening to me. So I wanted to make sure that we protect the supply, and we introduced legislation at that time to make it an offense to export prohibited drugs to US or anywhere else, and to create a mandatory monitoring network, supply monitoring network, to determine whether or not we have ongoing shortages and be prepared for them. At that time, the threatened shortage was the Tamiflu for avian influenza. And I understand that from Manitoba, huge amounts of that were going into the US, and we were afraid of running short if the pandemic ever occurred. So I'm not an expert. I just think the politicians in this country haven't done anything for the last, since 2005. We introduced legislation in October, and we were defeated in November, and that's now 14 years, and nobody's done anything, and we've had shortages all the time. Thousands of drugs have been in short supply over the years, unknown to most of us. So I rest my case.
Okay. Thank you, Yushel. That's really very helpful. That perspective is extremely important. Another thing that you brought up that I don't think any of us have really talked too much about is the politics of this issue, and I think that's something we'll want to come back into in our panel discussion. Seema, can I turn to you, please?
Hi, Seema Nagpal. I am the Vice President of Science and Policy at Diabetes Canada. I'm trained as a pharmacist and epidemiologist thereafter. At Diabetes Canada, we are a patient group. We represent people living with diabetes and prediabetes, and we have a very strong professional section, so as well reflect the views of those healthcare providers and researchers who help people with diabetes. So to start off, I just want to reflect on the fact that Canadians have a lot to be proud of in our history, and part of that proud heritage is the discovery of insulin. So Doctors Banting, Best, McLeod, and Collip discovered insulin and transformed the lives of people living with type 1 diabetes. So now it's 100 years later, and it's really heartbreaking to see that these insulin caravans are coming from the United States to Canada. And these are stories of US citizens who have to pay upwards of $340 per vial for insulin. This is a therapy that they require in order to live. They can't live without this insulin. And so it's completely understandable that these individuals are coming to Canada to get this life-sustaining therapy. They're desperate to access the medicines that they need. Canada provides a chance for life. So at the individual level, there is nothing but compassion. But we can't ignore that legislation at the state level doesn't just impact individuals, it impacts whole populations. And that we can't support the American population in their desire for insulin. The US has a population 10 times the size of Canada, and we certainly can't support their needs. Without considering, of course, the fact that that creates drug shortages here in Canada. And the spotlight has been on insulin because of the caravans, but it impacts all medications for diabetes and certainly all medications for all therapeutic areas to treat other conditions. So I think with all the other panelists, I agree that the pending US legislation, there is a significant threat to our drug supply, but it also creates a level of uncertainty that itself can cause panic. So we heard many times during these insulin caravans, we heard from people that they were wondering if they should stockpile insulin in response to the numerous people coming from the United States to Canada. Stockpiling itself can cause shortages. That's why we need strong and visible and definitive action by the government, not only to actually prevent the shortages, but to reassure patients that they will be able to access, that Canadian patients will be able to access the medicines that they need when they go to their pharmacy. And I think that we also need to take a step back to say that drug shortages do happen even regardless of this potential spike in demand. But access to medicine is a problem here in Canada as well. We have 25% of Canadians who live with diabetes saying that they can't take their medications as prescribed because of cost. So while we are here today to talk about cross-border sale of drugs and the cost of drugs in the U.S., we shouldn't feel too proud because it's not all peaches and cream here either. One of my friends said, it's really it's cheap and easy to get a diagnosis of diabetes, but it's the hard part comes after in terms of managing the illness. So I think this is obviously a focused discussion, but we have a broader conversation to have about ensuring the drug supply as well as ensuring that people get the access to drugs that they need.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Seema. I've picked up a couple of themes from the comments here. One is a theme about safety. And we'll come back to that in a second, Shabir. Obviously, shortages, the risk of shortages, and politics, the politics of this, especially in the U.S., obviously, but potentially to a certain extent in this country as well, and historically there has been. But I'd like to start with the safety part of it, Shabir. You talked about the counterfeit drugs being sold in the U.S. You all talked about the actions by some physicians and pharmacies selling or approving or signing off on drugs when they had no authority to do that. And that led to prosecutions in a number of cases, and a number of doctors lost their licenses. Like this, the practice encouraged inappropriate and illegal behavior. But on the safety part, my question, I guess, is with respect to the U.S. administration and the Health and Human Services and the FDA. They have taken the position for 15 years that they cannot find a way that would allow them to assure the safety of the drug supply coming in from Canada and elsewhere under any of these importation schemes that have been hatched by the various states and others. Why do they think they can do that now?
Well, their boss called. I mean, we actually have, I can distribute it, we have a graphic showing that every head of Health and Human Services in the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. since 2000 has opposed drug importation from Canada on safety and lack of cost savings. In fact, 4 former FDA commissioners wrote a joint letter, 2 appointed by Republican presidents, 2 appointed by Democratic presidents, a joint letter in 2017 saying that they didn't think that it was safe or that it would save money. But then populism in America happened, and this became a talking point of populism. And even our own Secretary Azar, who runs the Health and Human Services Agency, came out and called this policy proposal a gimmick. And then about 3 or 4 months ago, he announced that he was implementing it and it could be safe. That would hurt. But it was when I was on a call, a press call with the head of the Food and Drug Administration, Andy Sharpless, and Dr. Sharpless announced that they were full steam ahead with importation and they would not need any extra full-time equivalent staff to turn it into implementation. Which, as anyone who's done budgets will tell you, that's crazy. But yeah, that's what changed.
So I'm sure that's an important talking point for you when when you're meeting with those folks. That helps to explain, I guess, my next question, which is kind of to the group, which is why this issue has come back after 15 years. So is it just the populism in the States? Some touched on some specific issues about pricing on certain drugs in the States. What else has changed, in your view, that has brought this back to the fore today?
I'm not an expert on that. I mean, what I think has changed is you have a deranged president sitting in the Oval Office who watches television and picks up issues, and this is an easy issue for him to say, I'll solve your problem, we'll just go across the border and bring all of the medications you need at cheaper prices. I mean, that's what Trump is all about, and as Shabir mentioned, the health secretary obviously initially said it was a gimmick, and now the gimmick is a practical solution. That is all because of Trump. And what actually shocked me was that the Bernie Sanders of the world got into it and not understand how it would destroy us and wouldn't help them very much.
Brian, are there any economists in the U.S. government?
Any in the government or any who are actually listened to? Although I think I want to emphasize, Ujjal mentioned a certain deranged president. Let's face it, all of the leading presidential candidates think that this will work. And, there's the old saying that for every problem there is a solution, which is easy, obvious, and wrong. And this is that solution. If you look at Bernie Sanders' legislation, he thinks that he's dealt with this, the bill that he has proposed. They are not going to be buying from individual internet pharmacies. They are going to be buying, basically, I'm going to paraphrase here, or oversimplify. They're going to be buying essentially from wholesalers who've been approved by Health Canada. So the reason they're saying they won't need any more staff is they figure that Health Canada will already be monitoring these people. There has been a suggestion that the drug companies might respond to this by, doing what they've done in Europe and doing what they did here 15 years ago too, which is by restricting their shipments to Canadian wholesalers to roughly what they reckon the size of the Canadian market is. And most of the legislation that has been proposed in the U.S. Says that would be regarded as an anti-competitive activity in the U.S. And would result in penalties being brought against any drug companies which tried to restrict the quantity of drugs that they supply to Canadian wholesalers in order to prevent the wholesalers from being able to ship them back across the border to the United States. So these people think that they have actually solved all of the issues which were stumbling blocks back 15 years ago. In Henry IV, Part 1, Owen Glendower says, I can call demons from the vasty deep. And Hotspur says, anyone can call them. If you call them, will they come? And it's that last bit that politicians, and quite frankly in both countries, are not paying enough attention to. You can write all the legislation you want. That doesn't actually necessarily mean that it's going to work.
Fair enough.
Well, I don't know. I mean, but at least if you have legislation, it's better than nothing.
Yes, no, I'm not saying we shouldn't. And I agree that the legislation that you brought in should be dug out of whatever filing cabinet it's been buried in and revived. We need to do something to protect ourselves against the Americans doing something really, really dumb. But we also need to convince them. At the moment, the situation, as I say, is that drug companies are making noises about restricting supply and saying that, look, we've got contracts with wholesalers which don't let us let them somehow or other re-export drugs to the U.S. My apologies if I'm, to anyone from the pharmaceutical sector, if I'm making you sound villainous here. If we simply revive Ujal's legislation, then all we're doing is saying, okay, well, the drug companies are actually kind of off the hook because they will then be able to say, look, it's not us, it's those evil Canadians who are refusing to export to the United States. So yeah, I think we have to revive that legislation and modify it as necessary and maybe tack it onto the cannabis export legislation or something like that that's already there. But we need to go beyond that.
My sense, if I can just, my sense is that if we have legislation, the pharmaceutical companies obviously would not be able to say we're not going to supply you the drugs, even if the legislation doesn't necessarily succeed. But at the same time, it would then force the politicians across the border to really begin to confront the issues. Because we would have said, look, we're not going to help you legally. You deal with your pharmaceutical companies. You should force them, and you should regulate your own prices. And that is one way of helping the ordinary people of the United States of America, if we can.
One thing that complicates this whole issue is that everybody's sort of blaming a certain person down in the States, but there are actually 4 states that have passed legislation before the president and secretaries are sort of really opined on it. So Florida being a population of 25 million people, which is considerable compared to us. So I think and all of those plans and may have slight nuances to them. So when we're looking at legislation, I really don't envy the Canadian government right now because I think it is becoming more complex than maybe it was in 2005. It's a different administration in the States as well that kind of compounds the complexity. And you have to look at all of the different proposals that are being put forward and trying to create legislation or measures that are going to address the issue without creating sort of unintended consequences or loopholes that people are inevitably going to look at. So I remember talking to, I can't remember, it was a reporter who said, well, why don't we just make all medications prescription status? Because they thought, well, for insulin, it's just so easy to come up and you just don't even need a prescription. Well, that would have huge impacts on, Canadians' abilities to, get access to medication. So the policy levers are not easy. I think the Canadian government is also operating in and so maybe this is the politics here, but in an environment where they don't just have this to deal with the U.S., whatever government comes in, is they have other issues, trade issues. So they have to sort of look at this very cautiously. And so I'll opine from afar and I'll backseat drive all the way down to the States, but I think they are going to, they're going to be the ones making those hard decisions and the ones that, we'll all be measuring them against.
Yeah, we're in, if I may, we're in this situation partly because Americans think, or certain politicians think they found an easy solution to their problem. We've got to be very careful not to assume that there is an easy legislative solution to our problem as well. Yeah.
I think it's worth it to talk a little bit about the timeline that we're in, because our process is actually set. And as Joelle and I learned last week in a meeting in the States, it is on a train, the foot's to the floor, and there's a deadline, right? There's in 2003, this is super obscure, apologize. The Americans passed the Medicare Modernization Act, which actually contained all the rules for importing drugs from Canada, but it was predicated upon the Health and Human Services Department issuing regulations. So those regulations, as we learned, are being written now to the Food and Drug Administration, and they will be sent to the White House at the end of the year, and then probably put out for comment around April in the States. So we have a 60-day comment period where regulations have to be opined upon, and they have to respond. And then those will be released as a final rule in the fall of September of 2020, right before the American presidential election in November. This is a presidential election issue. You saw the 26th, as impeachment began to break the news in America, the White House released an announcement that they were finalizing a rule on Canadian importation. That has nothing to do with impeachment, and that's why the White House said something about it. The White House has announced that they're going to Florida on October 3rd to make a big announcement about health care in the Villages. The Villages is a retirement community in Florida where, coincidentally, the president and the governor also announced that they were doing Canadian importation. And so this is the kind of thing that you do when you want to change the news cycle message. And so it will not just be these 4 states, although these 4 states, Florida, Colorado, Maine, and Vermont, have all passed legislation for importation. But once the regs are out, any pharmacist or wholesaler, that's what the law says, in the U.S. may begin importing Canadian medication. So your problem will become a 50-state problem in the fall of 2020, which is not an enviable position for either of us, I think.
But one of the things also that we learned last week and that I've heard over the past few months working on this is that U.S. lawmakers, not just federally but at the state level, really don't have an understanding of how things are in Canada. So oftentimes you'll just hear, well, we're a great trading partner to Canada. Of course they're going to help us out with this. So, people like we've had the unfortunate privilege of working on these issues for a long time. I know them now, but they're not spending that kind of time researching and really learning about everything that's happening. So, the importance of having us kind of continuing to put the same message, to continue to go down to the state level, to have those conversations is really essential. It can't just be with the federal administration, which I don't think we're going to be able to convince otherwise at this point.
No, and the timing here is really important. If you're going to tell America no, will it be more or less embarrassing if you tell them no in December of 2019 or right before the election in 2020? I think the sooner you set the boundaries for what good neighbors do for each other, the less embarrassing it'll be for your southern neighbor.
Well, that's why I'm actually somewhat shocked that the governments in the last 14 years haven't done anything, because everyone knew this is coming at some point, because American politicians have shown themselves to be totally incapable of dealing with their own pharmaceutical industry. We knew this was coming. The legislation had already been passed but way back. And why is this not an issue in the election? Why are the journalists not raising this issue? I mean, this is a serious issue that goes to the core of our healthcare in Canada as we have it.
As I understand it, the administration has proposed very significant measures to control drug prices and to lower drug prices in the U.S. And they're very controversial, of course, but they're pretty aggressive. Is there any possibility that this push on the reimportation front is simply being used as a bargaining chip, as an attempt to put pressure on the pharmaceutical industry to engage more seriously in the discussions about ways of lowering prices?
It's possible. If you look at the history of the topic of importation in America, it rises and subsides with ameliorative measures that cover healthcare. So after the 2003 Medicare Modernization Act passed, and we had a wave of this as the best idea since sliced bread, we passed Medicare Part D prescription drug coverage in the states. And that gave everybody 65 and over a cheaper access to prescription drugs. And so that made importation go away as an issue for a while. And then during Obama's time, we passed Obamacare, increased the amount of people covered by insurance and therefore prescription drug coverage and reduced some of that call. But now we are seeing our uninsured numbers climb and co-pays climb, and so I think it's going to come back, and I don't know that it will go away this time.
I guess you also see in the States, you see the states are much larger drug purchasers than they were 15 years ago because of Medicare Part D. So I think the latest numbers I saw showed that the public funding of drugs in the U.S. is comparable to Canada because the plans for seniors and people on social assistance, et cetera. So suddenly those plans in those states kind of coming like our provinces, demanding lower prices. They're trying to manage and control their budgets, right? So it's a similar kind of situation, but that's why the pressure's coming more from governments as opposed to from public.
Look at Canadian, like they look at Canada as an easy solution.
Yeah.
They think it's just the easiest path, like with least resistance to moving forward to addressing that issue.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that they have on their side is the stories, right? It's heart-wrenching when you hear about the kid who went to university and was no longer on his parents' plan, so and passed out in class because he was unable to afford his insulin. The kids who heard his parents fighting about money and lowered his own dosages and experienced hypoglycemia. And so there's a ton of stories that are in the media about heart-wrenching stories about people who can't afford their medications. Insulin caught my eye. So it's hard, I think, to translate that into us opposing legislation when you hear at an individual level the impact of the current situation in the United States, the impact that has on individuals and kids and parents and grandparents and the whole gamut. But what caught my eye, or caught my ear, I guess, in hearing that our supply would be depleted in 165 days, that to me is very compelling. Not only because we would be out, but they too would be out. So, it's not an answer, not only because it could do harm to us, but because we can't be their supply, we can't be their pharmacy. So I think that's the messaging that we really need to get better at. It's not because we're being difficult or we don't want to be good neighbors or any of those things. It's really because we can't. Despite the stories that are coming out and the compassion that we have, it's not a viable solution, and I don't know that we've told that story very well yet.
Yeah, but again, you've got to remember that a number of these pieces of legislation say that any American drug company which restricts supply to Canadian wholesalers will be subject to sort of antitrust law in the U.S. So when they hear the 165 days thing, we're talking about that as though we've got this stockpile of 165 days worth of drugs, and that's it. Once they're gone, there is no possibility of getting any more until next year. What Bernie Sanders will say is, I have included in my legislation a requirement that the drug companies fill all of your orders. So when you approach the 165 days, you simply put in more orders for drugs, and more drugs come in, and we actually import more of them from you. So again, you've got this kind of magical thinking going on, and we've got the 165 days is something that I think some of them think that they have already dealt with in the proposed legislation.
But we have drug shortages anyway.
Oh yeah, but so do they. And we have drug shortages for different reasons, but that's a whole different panel.
Right, but I guess my point is that when there is a drug shortage for any reason, that will be experienced by the U.S. through Canada as well.
Yes.
So the legislation may not be able to address all of the gamut of drug shortages, which...
No, it can't. But as a broad speaking point, a lot of them think they have tackled that. And that's something that we have to keep in mind in trying to convince them, basically try to convince them that no, they haven't.
So what are some of the solutions? Obviously, this is an extremely complex topic, and Joel, thanks for saying it's even more complex than it was in the past, but I think you're right. So how do we go about addressing it? It seems to me like you've got to engage a lot of players in this in addressing it. So let's start with you. Well, I know what you're doing in part, right? You've already told us, but what more can an association such as the Pharmacists Association do to help educate and inform people about the implications, but also about some of the regulatory and legal challenges to implementing that kind of a scheme?
Well, a couple of things that we've been working on, obviously raising the public awareness has been huge, and I think it would even come to a surprise that Florida has put forward its plan and listed, I think for illustration purposes more than anything, but a list of medications that they would look to sort of import, and 3 or 4 out of them were actually short in Canada in the last 2-3 years. So I don't think I think we still need to do more to raise that public awareness. We're sort of in that fuzzy space right now in Canada because we are in an election, so governments are sort of closed for business for the time being. But one of the things that we've been working on with another group that Shabir works with is ASOP Canada, the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacies. And that's identifying kind of various scenarios. And obviously I've touched on shortages, and Shabir's talked on sort of the safety of the supply chain, but something that didn't exist as much in 2005 was the use and people going to online sources. Like, I don't remember ordering things in 2005 the way I do now. I didn't feel that level of comfort. I would have certainly never thought about ordering a medication online. And we know that about 20% of Canadians have actually looked online for medications, either because they couldn't afford it, they couldn't find it. And so we need to do a lot more education around kind of what online looks like and what it should look like. Because whatever happens, and even if some of the online pharmacies exist to just supply the Canadian market, that's going to come to Canada eventually, right? That's going to grow into Canada and expand here. Obviously, we want to be providing, convenient services to Canadians. I'm not suggesting that online pharmacies are bad. I'm just saying that we need to educate people on how to safely source those medications in that new form. So there's a lot to be done, and the timelines are tight. So hopefully the first item on the new government's agenda is going to be looking at the issue of importation and shortages, and kind of, when they talk about other pharmaceutical policies, I think it is important for them to recognize that they all sort of work in concert with each other. When we talk about pharmacare, what does that look like? It's not just about coverage. It should also be about, are medications even available in Canada to buy, no matter. So I think that, those conversations when the new government is going to come is going to be really important.
Good. That's helpful.
I hope those conversations come. I mean, part of the solution is a proactive government on this issue. I haven't seen a proactive government on this issue for the last many years, and whether it happens after the election or not. The issue that you were raising, Ryan, the issue of they have already solved the problem in the states with their legislation, but they may have only solved the problem with respect to a third of the drugs that come to us from the US. They may not have solved the problem with respect to the 2/3 other drugs that we consume, that some of which may come from other countries. And other countries may say, we're not going to supply you because you're reselling at a profit. Right? So I don't know. This is a very complex issue. You need, I'm really well informed now that I have heard all of the analyses, legal analysis. I mean, first of all, the government needs to sit down and figure out what all the laws mean currently, and then figure out what the response is. And what I have read in the newspapers has been a very anemic response from Health Canada so far, and I don't think that's very reassuring to Canadians.
Interesting comment. Seema, are your members engaged with this issue now? Are they aware of it? And what are their concerns? The shortages? Or do they have other concerns?
Yeah, I think especially during the media around the insulin caravans, that was a really big issue. We had a number of people calling, emailing, voicing their concerns about shortages, and that's the major concern, is that when they go to their pharmacy, they won't be able to get their prescription filled if they have a prescription, but to get their insulin. It's life-saving medication, and in some cases the shortage might be for a day, or it might be a little bit longer, and depending on the personal situation, that might be life-threatening. If the person is out of insulin at home, they need it right if they're experiencing a hypo or a hyper. They need to have the insulin available to manage their health acutely, not tomorrow, not in a couple hours, but right at that point. And so we did hear of situations where that was a problem, where they went to the pharmacy and were unable to fill the script. So that in that particular case, I think that's the case that you're referring to, Joelle. In that particular case, there were no health harms. The person did have their supply at home, but it could have been disastrous. And I mean, obviously disastrous for the individual and their family, but the implications of that, that harmful situation in terms of it getting out and people panicking about not being able to get their insulin, that could have had broad implications for all Canadians living with diabetes who treat with insulin and others. People have other medications that are life-sustaining, and I can see a whole rush to the pharmacy to get these filled because of the threat of insulin caravans, but as well as bus loads of Americans coming to take our drugs. So I think the panic that we started to feel was short-lived, but as the legislation gets approved and we start to see potentially this happening, I see that the potential for panic and the potential for stockpiling is going to quickly become a reality.
Sure, no question. And I assume that you have some discussions with your American counterparts, American Diabetes Association. Do they? I don't want to put you on the spot since we didn't talk about this before, but anyway, I guess I just put you on the spot. sorry about that. But have they taken a position? Are they in favor of it? Because after all, they're very concerned about the price of insulin in the U.S. So are they in favor of reimportation as a measure to help address that issue?
The ADA has been silent.
They've been silent. Okay.
To my knowledge, they've been silent.
Okay, good. Well, that's better than one of the alternatives.
I'm sorry? Have you tried to engage? They've been publicly silent.
They're in a tough position. Shabir, so apart from you, I don't really hear too many Americans saying this is a bad idea. Who else out there might be someone you can call in as an ally?
Well, if you work in the safety of the supply chain, you think this is a terrible idea.
Okay.
So when you talk privately to career public health people, if you talk with anyone that handles the supply chain, if you talk to anyone who is part of the $2 billion investment in track and trace, which is a barcode that follows a unit of sale of medicine from the factory floor to the pharmacist, to the back door of the pharmacy, they all think this is a terrible idea. And this is an important thing as you make policy in Canada to remember. Every time I speak with a Canadian, as I have over the past 10 years about this topic, they go through what I would call the Kubler-Ross importation cycle of emotions. It starts with denial, right? Where the Canadian will look at me and say, how could you possibly do this? This won't work. And I'll say, yes, we're in denial. We're going to do it anyway. And then they move to anger. They say, if you do this, you'll hurt us. And I say, yes, actually, yes, we will hurt you. That is a terrible thing. I wish we weren't doing that. And then they'll move into depression where they realize that we're actually going to do it. Because after hearing all that, they still do it. And so I was actually testifying in Maine with my colleague Don Bell, who's retired Canadian Border Services and Ontario Provincial Police, and he said, and he's an EpiPen dependent person. He came to the States with me, and he actually couldn't go to any of the dinners because there was an EpiPen shortage, he didn't have one. And Don testified to a Maine committee and said, if you do this, my EpiPen shortage problem will get worse. And they said, that's not our problem. So you need to understand, as you make policy as a country, that we don't understand subtle anymore. We don't even understand sometimes reason. You tell us it doesn't work, and we say, but is there a minuscule chance it will work? And if the answer is yes, whether or not you say it, if we think the answer is yes, we'll move forward anyway. So the response from the Canadians, if you actually want to see us change our behavior, must be clear, the way that you would behave with a toddler. It must have boundaries, and it must not rely upon the intellect of the person hearing it.
You can't top that.
don't have a mic to drop, but I should.
Yeah, I think we got the message. Okay. Brian, I have a bit of a convoluted question. Well, it's probably not convoluted. I'll make it convoluted, but I'm going to try and make it clear.
I'm an economist. Convoluted is my field.
Well, there you go. I recall in the piece that you wrote in the past.
Come on, I haven't read that in 15
Well,
years.
it's okay. Don't worry. I'm not going to. I'm just talking about a concept. But you indicated that if we had reimportation, that one of the impacts would be that it would lead to pressure to raise prices in Canada. And it's funny, as I mention that to some people, they say, "Oh, but they can't. We got price controls in Canada, so they can't do that. That won't happen." Okay, well, we'll leave that aside. But what struck me, though, Brian, in this is that these reimportation proposals kind of work on the assumption that we have a common market in pharmaceuticals in North America, and we don't. We have two totally separate markets. They're regulated completely differently. But lately, we've seen more and more initiatives on the regulatory side for drugs and devices to harmonize with other countries, especially the U.S. and Europe. And just over the summer, I saw something that maybe the folks who work in oncology will know more about this, but where Health Canada and the FDA have agreed on a joint review, basically, and so they can announce approval of new oncology drugs at the same time, with the notion that this will speed up access to these drugs. So as I'm seeing this greater harmonization with the regulatory side, I'm beginning to sort of question: are we going to see pressures to harmonize more in other areas that could impact this issue? So if the problem is the safety, et cetera, and regulatory, well, then why don't we have a common, U.S. Canada FDA, right? And why can't we handle it that way? Do you think there's any pressures for that, or there would be in the long run, as economists like to think in the long run?
We can move towards more cooperation on technical issues on approval, although, frankly, we will never move towards common approval of brand name drugs unless it comes down to the FDA making the decision. Because as soon as there's any suggestion that Canada might perhaps make the decision, somebody will utter the word thalidomide, and that will be the end of it. So the FDA is never going to give up its ability to, if not block, at least delay approval of a drug on the basis of requiring further information, and Health Canada shouldn't either. We can move towards greater cooperation in terms of technical information, standards of clinical trials and evaluation, which would make actually life a fair bit easier if we could get agreement on them. It could kind of cut down on duplication on certain technical issues. When we get into the question of whether that's going to lead to pressures for harmonization on markets, then we're getting into the, as I said before, the mess that the Europeans have been trying to sort out for the past 15 years, because you have countries like Greece and Spain, which through their national health systems keep the price of drugs low. They are also major sources of exports of drugs to other EU countries. Sweden gets a lot, Germany gets some, and the UK gets some from Greece and Spain. And that creates shortages in Greece and Spain. And they've got a common market, a single market, although the interpretation of it kind of depends on whether you're getting a ruling from the European Commission or the European Court of Justice. They're not entirely in sync on what countries are allowed to do, what pharmaceutical companies are allowed to do. And of course, none of them are going to say, well, no, Greece and Spain are going to have to raise their drug prices to the level of Swedish and German drug prices. But at the very least, Health Canada should be taking a close look at what's been going on in the EU in the past, decade or so. Mm-hmm. And I think coming back to things which have been hinted at here, Health Canada is going to have to take the lead on this in North America because Health and Human Services in the States isn't going to be able to. So Health Canada is going to have to be the body which starts doing the original thinking. And, it's done that in the past. There's no reason that it shouldn't be able to revive that now. I'm seeing both nods and shaking of heads.
Well, you raised another good topic.
Canada usually tells you, Minister, you can't do it.
Yes, Minister.
So we're getting to the point where I know there are a number of people in the audience who are getting itchy to ask a question or two. So before we move to that phase, I'd like to just pose a question to the panel in general, and appreciate your thoughts. Okay, following the election, a new Minister of Health is appointed, and you get a meeting with him or her very quickly into the new government. What do you propose that the government should do on this issue, if anything? What should it do? Who would like to jump in first?
They should be proactive. They should, I think, do some, again, how they engage with the Americans is, I think a bigger conversation, but they really need to get out there and make this a priority. And I would urge them to say you need to be very clear in your public statements that this is something that you will not support. I think to date they have made some comments about protecting the supply, but maybe to Shabir's point, that's not direct enough because they won't know that we're specifically referring to them. So I think that is the number one thing they probably need to make sooner rather than later. And if they are not, but I suspect there are some people who are quietly working, during this election period on some policy options. If they're not, they should be certainly directing the department to be doing that. I am hopeful. I do believe that the department is actively working on some of those.
Do you know whether they are?
Yeah, well, I haven't seen their super secret Health Canada papers, but I do think there are people who are doing it, and have heard some of our comments in the past about what those might look like. I would urge them, and lastly, I probably would urge them not just to look at, and I think this is maybe one of the things that I might be a bit concerned about, is not just to look at the federal administration proposal, because again, there are a number of other state plans, and there are other aspects of this whole process that wouldn't be captured in that, and we're talking often about the sort of counterfeit business that in 2005 did not exist to the level that it does now. And if I was an American right now and I was seeing just headlines, they're not going through and reading the federal proposal or the Florida plan the way maybe I might, we'll say, well, it's legal now, I can go. The president said I can. We'll go up on website, we'll say, they won't know who Shoppers Drug Mart is, they won't know who a smaller pharmacy is. They're just going to look up at what's most convenient and look for a price that they're looking for. And we have a sterling reputation now as a very safe supply of medication, but that kind of growth is not going to be great. And as soon as you have one or two Americans getting a medication that they think is legitimate and they suffer an adverse reaction, and we have some cases in the States of that happening, they're going to come back and they're saying, this is Canada's fault. This is your Canadian online pharmacy said this. And it's not going to be great for our reputation. So they need to look at all of those. First day one.
Well, that'll keep them busy for quite some time. But I was about to make a comment about maybe that's why pharmacare is kind of backburnered, but I'll leave that aside. So is anyone ready to go out on a limb and be a little more specific about what they should do? Should they bring back Usal's bill?
Yes.
From
First
2005?
thing you do is bring in export control legislation. It's the principle of hitting a mule over the head with a 2x4. You've got to catch its attention. And even if you're not planning to push that as your only solution, you do actually have to catch Americans' attention and convince them that, no, you have not resolved the problems, no matter what you think you have said in your legislation. Then we have to get more subtle. We have to separate out the issues in the generics market from the issues in the brand name market. And within the brand name market, we've got to separate out the issues of small molecule drugs from the issues of biologics. And that's the point. I mean, on the generics market, that's one where international cooperation could, in fact, be a very valuable policy, not just dealing with price issues in the US, but with shortages in Canada and the US. That's the one we always used to assume that the Chinese and Indian generic companies were going to make everything wonderful there. In recent years, we have learned that their quality control, what's the term, sucks. And therefore, we have to rethink our view of the international generics market. But it is an area which could be tackled separately from the brand name drug market, and to the major benefit of both countries, in fact of a number of countries, through trade and production agreements. And then we have to separate out, as I say, the issues of small molecule drugs from the issues of biologics. And those are going to get more difficult. And there I'm going to run out of time.
Shabir, any suggestions from your perspective?
Well, I mean, Canadian solutions should come from Canadians. But I will say this, which is that too many people in my country are suffering from our broken healthcare system. And this policy unicorn of Canadian importation is not making the road to reform any faster. So the sooner you close off that opportunity, the sooner we will actually make the hard choices to fix what's broken and alleviate the suffering. And so I hope you do it clearly and decisively and soon.
Seema?
I like the analogy of the 2x4 and the mule, just because I think that there needs to be definitive action, whether the proposed legislation actually goes through or whether it works. I think we could have a long discussion about, because it's so complicated, and there's so much drug policy stuff going on right now, and there's lots of other issues in terms of trade and politics with the United States that all has an impact on the ultimate success of any legislation. But the fact that we need to have a visible and public demonstration that the government does not support this type of cross-border sale, I think is necessary, both to make that statement to the Americans, but also to speak back to Canadians. So I'm not a legislative expert, but I think that public statement is essential, and we need it quickly.
Great. Well, I think this is a good time to stop the panel discussion and invite questions from the floor. So, gentleman right here.
Thank you very much.
I think there's a microphone somewhere.
I'm Dr. Pulido, chairman of the International Center of Regional Innovation here in Ottawa, previously in the Laboratory Center for Disease Control. This panel has raised out one thing that we have done many years with smart regulations and others. My question is, one of the things that I have done through the public service was the renewal of the biotechnology strategy and the commercialization of other products coming from biotech. One of the things that I'm raising here is an issue to resolve, because I thought this morning could bring that opportunity, is that we can synthesize insulin extremely cheap in Ottawa, in Canada, following the regulations of Health Canada and FDA. To us, a shortage of insulin is a no-brainer. We can synthesize insulin, erythropoietin, somatostatin, you name it. The issue here is that small, medium-sized enterprises that can do the follow-on generics do not have the market in Canada. Canadian market is not the Canadian market that will maintain their existence. That's a very small market. So my point in here is, I hope that in terms of that legislation that is talking about exportation limitations, that doesn't abruptly cut off an opportunity for small, medium-sized enterprises to actually take this as an opportunity. We can have insulin tomorrow, if you want, with the highest standards, following the harmonization that we were talking about on NICE and so on. I was in the panel on what parameters we should take into account for doing biosimilarities and follow-on, such as thiolation and other properties. These were expertises that we harness here in Ottawa. And yet, there is no small, medium-sized enterprises that have been taking advantage of this huge market because we have limitations in terms of marketing. So my question is, I hope that in that legislation or proposal, we see this as an opportunity. Come and buy as much insulin as you want, made in Canada. Thank you.
Thanks. Any reaction from the panel on that? And then we'll go over here.
You know, Florida set aside $25 million to implement Canadian importation about a month ago. And I know the suggestion fell on deaf ears, but I don't know why they didn't start putting their own contracts for their government health care plan out for consolidated bid for buying pharmaceuticals from their own manufacturer, because Florida alone has the demand to actually make it profitable to make pretty much any generic medication. Why they're not doing that, I don't know, because that would make a lot more sense.
Yeah, from an economic point of view, insulin is an absolutely fascinating case of, I mean, it's, face it, a long-established biologic. But the whole issue of follow-on biosimilars, the whole issue of the separate markets, and for that matter, the whole issue of delivery mechanisms for the insulin as well. The inhalable insulin that came out that was supposed to be an absolute blockbuster and was a complete flop, partly because in the same time as the inhalable insulin was being developed, you had the development of insulin pens as opposed to syringes, so the big attraction of the inhaler disappeared. But you know, insulin in the U.S., the market is controlled, I think, by what, 3 firms? And the restrictions, the issues on entry and approval of biosimilar production, of follow-on production, is one of the most important ones that we're going to have to deal with, not just with insulin, but with biologics generally.
There are 2 myths I think people, have sort of, this is exposed. One is people will say, well, why don't we just ramp up production here in Canada, or why don't we just order more? And 2 of those things I think are, we don't have a manufacturing sector here so much in Canada. I mean, in terms of production is mostly done globally with some exceptions. So to ramp up on a broad, spectrum of medication, we're not just talking, unfortunately, about insulin, we're talking about heart medication, blood pressure medication, antidepressants that have been, like you were talking about, a broad range, is very difficult. And ordering more is just not how things work. We're 2% of the global supply chain. Allocation is pretty much determined on an annual basis based on precedent of what we've consumed in previous years. So it's not as easy as just saying, well, Canadians should make more and should order more, because that's just not the practical reality of global supply these days. So while I think that those opportunities, we should be talking about them maybe more on a long-term basis when we're talking about pharmaceutical policy in Canada, it's not an immediate kind of solution to this problem that will happen very quickly, and where those things are going to take quite a while to kind of create that capacity in Canada, if ever even comes here.
Thanks for the question. Good discussion. Over here, if we can get the microphone.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Kelly Masadi. I'm the Director of Public Issues for the Canadian Cancer Society. And I guess I'm looking for a little bit of advice. The Cancer Society doesn't typically talk about patient-specific drugs or specific therapies. We speak very generally about, things like access to employment insurance, sickness benefits, and broader health policies. So if you have a room full of people right now who are paying attention to this issue, what would your advice be for an organization like mine to sort of rally the troops and get my senior leadership talking about this issue? So is it approaching the political side of things, or is it rallying that sort of grassroots movement and making people aware that this is a problem?
I'd say both.
Yeah, I'd say both
I'd say both.
Yeah, it's so relevant to patients. It's one of those, like I said, it's a heart-wrenching situation that nobody wants to deny access to meds to Americans, but the flip side is you don't want to have to be denied or not have access. So I think it would be, and my experience is that people get really scared. So having that grassroots movement and having people speak loudly about their concerns and their fears of what that implies for themselves, that's not that hard. And senior leadership responds to that. So I think that all patient groups should be screaming from the rooftops here that this is a major concern for us and that we need to demand from our governments that they act on this and that they protect Canadians' access to medicines. I think it has potential to be a very big deal, and to allow governments to put it on the back burner and to react or to continue to make, I don't know, backroom deals or whatever's going on that doesn't give us some transparency of that they've got us, they got our back here, to allow that to continue to happen. It's not right, and it's on us to make sure that we hold them accountable.
Let me just add one thing to it. In politics, when you are at the other end as a minister or as an MP, there is nothing more frightening than dozens of emails and scores of letters coming in. It is not just you or your friends going to lobby the minister or lobby the MP. That is good, but that's not enough. They need to see scores of letters and emails being bombarded into their offices, and then they might begin to act. When they have so many pulls and pushes going on at them that they need to be jolted out of their inertia that happens when you have so many things coming at you to pull you in one direction or the other, and you can do that with a grassroots campaign as well as lobbying in their offices.
Do we have any sort of coordinated solution right now, or a comment that as sort of health organizations or the health sector could bring forward as a joint statement, or is it more about and I guess maybe it's both, making Canadians aware that this is an issue and then creating sort of that grassroots mobilization?
So I think on the having worked at the Cancer Society, I can say two things. One is, if you look at the number of drugs that are short, oncology drugs do make up a fairly important percentage of those medications that are short. So we're not talking about product-specific examples. We're just talking about a general trend in the availability of oncology medications. And so if that's not a rallying cry for CCS to be involved, I think that should be sort of a first point. When we're talking about importation, we're talking about, again, like I said, it's not just insulin. I know we focused a lot on insulin today because Bernie Sanders came up and made a huge to-do at a pharmacy, and it was, we have these individuals come, but they're targeting HIV medications, epilepsy medications. They're targeting oncology drugs. So, I don't think you have to be invested in saying we don't want them to import X medication. It's about a kind of broader approach to that. So, those policy solutions, I think we're all invested in. All patient groups probably will say the same thing, whether it's insulin or chemotherapy or whatnot.
Joel, do you want to also maybe just comment on the coalition that we've established? You're helping to lead it, so I'll give it to you.
Well, so there are about 15 organizations that came together, and in our world, when 15 groups can come together and sign one letter, it's amazing. To say, to express to the health minister before the timing was great in some ways, because we were able to send this letter to the health minister to express our concerns about importation, and then it so happened to be that 2 days later, the president announced that plan. So for us, it was a good platform to say, we are talking about this and we have been talking about it. But if anybody wants to be involved in that, I think we're always looking for partners to kind of amplify that message and make sure that, it's not just coming from the pharmacist or the diabetes. I think if we all are able to come together, I see, the medical associations here and others to say this is a problem that's going to affect all of us, I think it becomes much harder to ignore.
Yeah, I have a list now. So we'll start over here, and we'll come back here and here.
It's a good sign.
Yeah.
People are asking
So you're gonna get some exercise there, running that microphone back and forth.
Hello, my name is Hannah Kepka, and I work for Campaign Life Coalition. And I have a question. Are there any shortages of the abortion drugs, such as RU486 or Mifegymis or any other brands?
I haven't heard of any. The availability of those medications for a variety of reasons may not be what we would like it to be, but I haven't heard of any actual sort of shortages from a lack of availability or an API issue globally. So.
Next question is over here, Lasha.
Good morning. I just want to thank everybody for the very thoughtful and nuanced commentary, insights shared this morning. I've been tracking this issue. I was around 15 years ago, more in the Canadian Ontario government, but so thank you all. Just curious if I can tap into all that insight for just a further suggestion. I mean, this is a difficult time for the Canadian government, and kudos to you and your coalition, because you were able to provoke a comment from the Prime Minister and also Minister of Health that Canada will step in to preserve its supply. I hadn't expected them to take that kind of stance. But it's a difficult time. U.S. and Canadian relations are strained and challenged. Canadian-Chinese relations strained as well. Can you suggest an approach? I mean, as much as it would feel good to use the 2x4 approach, I imagine our colleagues and friends at Global Affairs Canada are wary of doing anything to antagonize the top person in the White House. USMCA not yet ratified. And many other opportunities for the president to take a strong stance on or inflict some pain on Canada in some other way. He might not be happy about the Canadian pricing scheme that's just been introduced, which is yet a further example of a freeloading country taking advantage of U.S. investments in innovation. So what's the nuanced approach, if you wish? Although the 2x4 approach, I really, I think it would be really fun and feel good. But given the challenges that our global affairs people have, any suggestions for them about what they might do in the short or medium term?
Well, there are some legal regulatory measures that exist now around export licenses that we could be, there are some policy, things that we have at our disposal that we could be using. And I think we need to be working towards those. And I'm always a fan of sort of ramping up as opposed to trying to kind of start with a really strong position and kind of, I wouldn't say strong, but a kind of very aggressive position and trying to dialing it back. So I think that's the challenge. I don't think there's an easy solution, to be honest, Lasha, about what, because we've heard that from Global Affairs very directly, that this is, they're not really sure. And certainly months ago, I would say they thought, this is just one more time. We went through this in 2005. This is never really going to happen. I think for us, it's just been trying to put the pressure on to say, actually, it's gotten a lot further than it has in the past, and we need to address that. But this is sort of the conundrum, is that we don't envy them because they have to make those decisions. And the policy levers, if they're going to be effective, probably need to be quite direct and strong if they're going to have any impact. What we said last week to HHS was we went through all of our concerns and said, we're not here to hammer you on this. We're not here to give you a tough time, but here's sort of what's happening for us and here why we're challenged. And their response was like, yeah, no, I feel you, but that's not where we're going to go with this. So that sort of subtle approach is maybe not one that will be able to get those long term.
There are always competing interests around the cabinet table, competing tensions. And Global Affairs is always going to say, look, don't rock the boat. You need a Minister of Health who comes in and saying, you got to do this, and be able to persuade the Prime Minister eventually. It's not the cabinet that matters, it's the Prime Minister. And then bring in the strongest possible legislation. You can always read it down, you can always regulate it down, but you need to start from the strongest possible position. And you can't give in to this temptation to please who is in the Oval Office. That would never work, not with this president in particular. So if we don't take that strongest position, then we're not in a good negotiating position.
Okay, that's helpful. Question here.
Hi, my name is Mary O'Keefe. I'm a former executive at Health Canada, so I'm listening to all these comments with great interest and some bemusement because I do know how the system works very well. First of all, thank you for a fantastic discussion. Just the caliber of the panelists and the different perspectives you bring has been really, really interesting. I wanted to build on what some people were talking about in terms of building awareness and building some momentum on this issue. And starting with 15 organizations getting together and lobbying a minister is a very good first step, I would argue. I would also argue that you need to get very active in building public demand for this. Like, I think many of us in the room were very surprised to learn of the extent of existing shortages in Canada. I was completely unaware of that. So that's a really important first step. You need a really compelling, can just be one person who's a really compelling spokesperson who can mobilize public interest and get the media interested. You need to do very active social media. I'll give you a recent example of when the government finally provided a settlement to the victims of thalidomide. Someone brought that up earlier. Interestingly, that woman at the FDA who turned down thalidomide was a Canadian. And then we approved it here in Canada. But they had been trying for many, many years, and there have been a number of different campaigns that failed. And at the end of the day, they had just a dynamo of a spokesperson who got a lot of media attention, and things happened. So, you know, your time is ripe. All the lobbying organizations in the room, I'm assuming you did all your lobbying long before now, because the alternative policy proposals are already in the can, waiting for the new government, and a new government will come in, the departments will pitch them on stuff, mandate letters will be written, and if you're not in there, you know, you're going to wait for another 4 years. So the time is now. You've got it. The media are looking for stories. They're all bored because the polls aren't moving right now. You know, a lot of stuff happened. Polls should have moved. They haven't moved since the campaign began. You got 3 weeks to play with. So what are you going to do?
Thank you.
Well, let me say something a little bit out of left field with regard to the media. The press have been doing a lousy job covering the whole drug pricing issue, why drug prices are what they are. Apologies to any of the representatives of the press who might be here, but you have. It's not enough just to do the sob stories. It's not enough just to say evil pharmaceutical companies. There are reasons, some of them institutional, some of them actually quite valid, why drug prices are what they are. If you think about the latest generation of hepatitis C drugs, when the first of those came out, all kinds of fuss. Now, admittedly, it was a public relations mistake to price it at $1,000 a pill. $995, nobody would have noticed. $1,000 a pill was too nice a round number. But if you look at the natural progression of hepatitis C, you look at the probability that at some point in the future, somebody with hepatitis C will require a liver transplant. You figure in the future cost of the liver transplant, you discount it back to the present, you apply the probabilities. All this is from those stats classes that, you kind of hope you never had to hear from again. But the pricing of those drugs was actually quite justified in terms of the long run cost savings on hospital costs. The other thing with regard to those drugs is that they now, within 2 or 3 years, because of competition in that market, their price fell to somewhere between 25 and 40%, depending on the drug, of the price at which it had been released. There is an analytical story, which is a difficult one to tell, but it's an important one if you want to get across to people what we can do and why we have to be doing different things about different drugs.
You know, the Hep C drug the Hep C cure drug is actually an amazing story scientifically, but it's also an amazing story of addressing a world that we operate in America without price controls. Because Mississippi actually has a big Hep C problem. And the state, instead of going immediately to Canadian importation, went to instead this idea of doing a Netflix-style auction. So they held an auction and said, we would like a vendor to provide us 3 years of Hep C cure for as many pills as we need for our residents. And we want to pay one price every year. We don't care how many residents have Hep C. If it's less, you make more money. If it's a lot, you make less money, or maybe you lose money. But we want to pay that same amount in their state budget line every year for 3 years. And they held an auction. And it was, and 3 companies bid. And now they have a very stable, very aggressive, and very predictable amount that they're paying for that medicine every year. Now, are programs like that easier than importing from a wholesaler in Canada? No, right? It costs them money to run that auction. It costs them that money to do procurement. But does it actually address drug prices? Yes, absolutely it does. And those more complex solutions need to be made the easiest ones so that we can actually do the reform we need to do to make our system work better.
So unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, and I had Jerry lined up over here, and I know there are some more hands up, and my apologies for that.
I just wanted to come back to a comment that Lasha made reference to. The recent changes in pharmaceutical pricing review regulations in Canada, in fact, are going to, rather than sort of help the situation, are actually going to make it worse. So, you know, we've been hearing in the commentary that people have been made that the savings that are available through this policy in the U.S. are relatively small because, you know, there's a lot of middlemen involved in taking a chunk of the action. But, you know, if Canadian prices are reduced as a result of this current regulatory change here, to the extent that we expect that they're going to be, the benefits to the U.S. of taking this action are going to be significantly higher. So just wondering if that has been part of the dialogue, you know, from you folks who were in the U.S. You know, have you been talking to them about the impact of the PMPRB changes, for example? Have we been talking to the Canadian government around, you know, the follow-on effects, the implications of that legislation?
I have not pointed out to American politicians that this idea is even more financially attractive than it was a year ago. No.
That's what he said.
Don't forget that there is some suggestion in the U.S. that they should, I think it's come out of the White House actually, move to international reference pricing as well. From the economist's point of view, international reference pricing is a mistake, and we should be doing domestically focused value-based pricing. But they are aware of international reference pricing.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we'll have to close things off here. Just wanted to comment. I had one question kind of in reserve that I was going to ask if the need arose, and I just discovered that I don't need to ask it at all. My question was going to be, should Canada be reactive or proactive in response to these initiatives coming out of the U.S.? And I think the answer from our panel is quite clear, that it needs to be proactive. That's what I'd call a 2x4 anyway. I'd call that proactive. So I thank you very much. I want to please join me in thanking Brian Ferguson and our entire panel for their comments and discussion this morning. It's been very illuminating. It helps to highlight both the importance of this issue and the complexity of the issue, and the need for us all to engage and encourage others to become engaged, and encourage our new government to take this on in a big way when it comes into office. So thank you so much, everyone.